The silver wolf medallion hanging from Kieran's neck caught the firelight as he stepped inside, snow cascading from his midnight black cloak like fallen stars. Mira's breath caught in her throat, not from the frigid air that rushed in with him, but from the sheer presence of the man himself. He was larger than the stories claimed, his shoulders broad enough to fill the doorframe, and younger, too, perhaps only a handful of years older than herself. But it was his eyes that made her soul recoil, those amber depths that seemed to see straight through flesh and bone to the trembling heart beneath. "Well," he said, his voice carrying the rumble of distant thunder, "this is unexpected." Mira's fingers tightened around the heel of bread she'd been clutching like a lifeline. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs had turned to water, and besides, where could she go? The blizzard outside would claim her within minutes, and the cabin had only one door. She was trapped with the monster who had orchestrated the destruction of everything she'd ever loved. The word emerged as barely a whisper. She tried again, forcing steel into her voice despite the way her hands shook. "I thought it was abandoned." Kieran's dark eyebrows rose slightly as he pushed the door closed, the solid thunk of the latch falling into place sounding like a death knell. Most people can read the warnings carved into the trees. The wolf's head symbols aren't exactly subtle. He began unwinding his cloak with deliberate movements, never taking his gaze from her face. Unless, of course, desperation makes one blind to such things. The accusation in his tone made heat rise in her cheeks, even as fear continued to course through her veins like ice water. Mira lifted her chin, drawing on the last reserves of pride she possessed. "I can read perfectly well. I simply chose to ignore them." "Chose to ignore them," he repeated, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. How refreshingly honest. Most thieves at least attempt to lie their way out of such situations. "I'm not a thief." The words burst from her before she could stop them, sharp with indignation. Kieran gestured to the bread in her hands, then to the small pile of dried meat and cheese she'd gathered on the table beside her. "Then what would you call this? An aggressive form of borrowing?" Shame burned hot in her chest, but Mira forced herself to meet his gaze. "I call it survival." The single word hung between them like a challenge. Kieran studied her for a long moment, taking in her torn cloak, the hollows beneath her eyes, the way her once copper hair had dulled to the color of old pennies. When his expression softened fractionally, it somehow made him more terrifying, not less. "How long?" he asked quietly. "What? How long since you've eaten a real meal, not whatever scraps you've been surviving on in the wilderness?" The question was so unexpected that for a moment, Mira could only stare at him. This wasn't how interrogations by enemy kings were supposed to go. Where were the chains, the threats, the immediate execution she'd been bracing herself for? 3 days, she lied, unwilling to admit the true scope of her desperation. "Try again." His tone was patient but implacable, and Mira felt something inside her crack under the weight of those amber eyes. "A week, maybe longer. Time blurs when you're—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "When you're what? Running?" There was something almost gentle in the way he said it, as if he understood what it meant to flee from everything familiar. "What are you running from, little thief?" The endearment made her flinch. "Don't call me that." "Which part? Little or thief?" "Either. Both." She straightened her shoulders, trying to summon some semblance of dignity despite her circumstances. "My name is Mira." "Mira," he repeated, and the sound of her name in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. And what brings Mira to steal food from the Alpha King's private cabin during the worst blizzard in a decade? The casual way he referenced his title, as if it were simply another fact about himself, like his height or the color of his hair, made her stomach lurch. Here she stood, face to face with the architect of her people's suffering, and he was asking about her motivations, as if they were discussing the weather. "You know what brings me here," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind howling outside. "Your army saw to that." Something shifted in Kieran's expression, a flash of what might have been pain crossing his features so quickly she almost missed it. "My armies," he murmured, and there was a strange note in his voice that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. "Tell me, Mira, what exactly do you think you know about my armies?" The question hung in the air like a blade poised to fall, and Mira felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever she thought too deeply about that night. The night everything ended. "I know enough," she said, but even as the words left her lips, she could hear how hollow they sounded. "I know they came in the dead of night. I know they burned everything." "Do you?" Kieran's voice remained maddeningly calm, but she caught something flickering in those amber eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or something darker. "And where were you when this burning happened?" The memory rose unbidden, as it always did when she let her guard down. The acrid smell of smoke, the screams, the way old Henrik had shoved her toward the root cellar behind the herb garden, his weathered hands surprisingly strong, as he pressed a traveling pack into her arms. "I was working," she said, the lie coming as easily as breathing. It was the story she'd told herself 100 times in the long months since, the version that made sense, the version that didn't require her to examine too closely why Henrik had been so insistent she hide, why he'd looked at her with such desperate urgency and whispered words that still made no sense. "They're coming for you specifically, child. You must run, and you must never look back." "Working," Kieran repeated, and there was something almost skeptical in his tone. "At night? During a festival celebration?" Mira's blood chilled. She hadn't mentioned it was during the Harvest Moon Festival. She was certain she hadn't. "How did you—" "I make it my business to know the details of every military action undertaken in my name," he said, moving closer to the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face, making his expression impossible to read. "Curious, though. Most of the survivors I've spoken with mentioned everyone being gathered in the town square when the attack began, sharing honey cakes and autumn wine under the stars, weren't they?" Survivors. The word hit her like a physical blow. "There were others who escaped?" Something shifted in Kieran's posture, a subtle tension that hadn't been there before. A few. Mostly those on the outskirts of town. Farmers who saw the smoke and fled into the hills. He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "None of them mentioned seeing you, though. Strange, for such a small village." Mira's mouth went dry. She could feel the conversation spiraling away from her, heading toward territory she couldn't afford to explore, not when every instinct she possessed was screaming at her to maintain the simple story she'd constructed. Refugee, survivor, victim of circumstance. But the truth was more complicated than that, wasn't it? The truth was 3 months of waking every morning in a different hiding place, never staying anywhere long enough to form connections, or relationships that might anchor her to the world of the living. The truth was that she'd become a ghost, haunting the edges of her own life, sustained only by the fierce determination to stay alive long enough to— what? She'd never been able to finish that thought. "I kept to myself," she said finally. "I was the village herbalist. People came to me when they needed healing, but otherwise—" She shrugged, hoping the gesture looked casual rather than desperate. "Otherwise, I preferred solitude." It wasn't entirely a lie. She had been the herbalist, had spent her days in the cottage on the village's eastern edge, surrounded by drying bundles of chamomile and foxglove, rue and wormwood. Had found peace in the precise measurements required for tinctures and salves, the quiet satisfaction of easing pain with nothing, more than knowledge passed down through generations. But even that life, the only life she could remember, had felt somehow borrowed, like a costume that didn't quite fit. There had always been something else lurking beneath the surface, a restlessness that no amount of routine could quiet. Dreams that felt more like memories, filled with grand halls and unfamiliar faces, a longing she couldn't name for something she'd never had. "A healer," Kieran said, and for the first time since entering the cabin, he sounded genuinely surprised. "That's unexpected." "Why?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended. "Because your kind prefers to deal in death rather than life?" "Because," he said slowly, "the reports I received mentioned no herbalist, no healer of any kind in Millbrook." The name of her village in his mouth felt like a violation, but it was the certainty in his voice that made her stomach drop. Military reports were thorough things, she knew. They catalogued everything, every building, every resident, every potential threat or asset, If there was no mention of a village herbalist, then either the reports were wrong or, "You're lying," she whispered. But the accusation felt hollow even to her own ears. Kieran's expression had gone carefully neutral, but she could see the calculations happening behind those amber eyes. "I never lie about military matters, Mira. The question is, are you?" The accusation hung between them like a sword, and Mira felt something fundamental shift in the air of the cabin. The warmth from the fire seemed to recede, leaving her suddenly cold despite the crackling flames. Kieran's amber eyes had sharpened, no longer merely curious but actively hunting for something she couldn't name. "I'm not," she began, but the words died in her throat. Because wasn't she lying? About so many things she couldn't even keep track of them all anymore? No? Kieran took a step closer, and she caught the scent of winter air and something else. Pine and leather and an underlying wildness that made her pulse quicken. "Then perhaps you can explain why a woman who doesn't exist in any official records was so important that someone went to considerable trouble to erase every trace of her presence from Millbrook." The bread fell from Mira's nerveless fingers, hitting the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "That's impossible." "Is it?" His voice was dangerously soft now. "Because I've had my best people investigating every aspect of the Millbrook incident for months. Every cottage searched, every survivor interviewed, every record examined." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "And yet here you stand, claiming to have lived there for years, when according to everything we found, the cottage on the eastern edge, the one where an herbalist would have practiced, has been empty for over a decade." The room began to spin around her, reality tilting on its axis. Mira reached out blindly for the edge of the table, her legs threatening to give out entirely. "No, that's not. I remember. I remember everything. The garden behind the house, the way the morning light came through the kitchen window, the patients who came for help." But even as she spoke, the memories felt suddenly insubstantial, like trying to grasp smoke. Had there been patience? She could recall mixing tinctures, grinding herbs, but when she tried to summon specific faces, specific ailments, there was only a strange blankness. "Tell me about Henrik," Kieran said quietly, and the name hit her like a physical blow. "How do you know about Henrik?" The question came out as barely a whisper. Because Henrik Weatherby was real. He was the village baker, and he did die that night trying to help people escape. Kieran's expression had softened slightly, but his voice remained relentless. "What I want to know is why a simple village baker would risk everything to save someone who supposedly didn't exist." The world lurched beneath her feet. Henrik the baker? But that was wrong, all wrong. Henrik he'd been... "They're coming for you specifically, child." The memory surfaced with crystalline clarity. Not Henrik the baker, but Henrik in a fine coat she'd never seen before, pressing something into her hands, something that clinked like metal against metal. "You must run, and you must never look back. There are people who will try to tell you lies about who you are, about where you come from. Don't listen to them. Not until you're ready. Not until it's safe." "I don't understand," she breathed. But that wasn't entirely true, was it? Because somewhere deep inside, in a place she'd locked away and refused to examine, she was beginning to. Kieran moved closer, and she could see her own confusion reflected in his amber eyes. "Neither did I, until 3 days ago, until I received a message that changed everything I thought I knew about the war, about the attacks, about you, about me." The words came out strangled. He reached into his cloak and withdrew something small and gleaming. When he held it up to the firelight, Mira's knees nearly buckled. A silver pendant. Not a wolf's head like the one at his throat, but something far more intricate. A tree whose branches formed the outline of a crown, whose roots spelled out words in a script she somehow knew how to read despite never having learned it. "Blood of 2 kingdoms. Where did you get that?" she whispered. But she already knew. Could suddenly remember the weight of it around her neck, the way it had always felt warm against her skin, the way Henrik had pressed it into her palm along with the traveling pack before pushing her toward the root cellar. "It was delivered to me along with a message," Kieran said, his voice strangely gentle. A message that claimed the last princess of Valdris didn't die in childhood as we all believed. That she was hidden away, her memories altered, her very existence erased from all records to protect her from those who would use her bloodline to claim both thrones. The pendant swayed hypnotically in the firelight, and with each movement, Mira felt something cracking open inside her chest. Memories that weren't memories, dreams that felt more real than her waking life, the persistent sense that she was living someone else's story. "That's insane," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Kieran took another step closer, close enough now that she could see the flecks of gold in his amber eyes. Because the message came with very specific instructions. "Find the lost princess. Bring her home." And it was signed by someone I thought was long dead. He paused, watching her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent. "Your brother sends his regards, little sister." The words shattered something fundamental inside her, and Mira felt 28 years of carefully constructed reality begin to crumble. The pendant fell from Kieran's fingers, hitting the wooden floor with a crystalline chime that seemed to reverberate through Mira's very bones. She stared at it lying there, that impossible piece of silver that felt more familiar than her own heartbeat, and something inside her chest began to fracture. "No." The word escaped her lips like a prayer, desperate and breathless. "No, you're wrong. You're lying." But even as she spoke, images flashed behind her eyelids. Not the cottage in Millbrook, not Henrik's weathered baker's hands, but marble corridors that stretched toward infinity. A woman with kind eyes and auburn hair singing lullabies in a language that made her soul ache with recognition. A boy with laughing green eyes who called her Mira Bird and taught her to climb the ancient oak in the palace gardens. "I would be a baker's daughter," she whispered, backing away from the pendant as if it were a venomous snake. "I grew up in a cottage. I learned herbalism from my mother before she died. I remember." The memories felt like sand between her fingers, dissolving even as she tried to grasp them. Had there been a mother? When she reached for the woman's face, all she found was that singing voice and auburn hair that matched her own. "Your brother is alive, Mira." Kieran's voice was impossibly gentle, as if he understood that each word was another crack in the foundation of everything she'd believed. "Prince Adrian of Valdris survived the coup that killed your parents. He's been searching for you for 15 years. Stop." She pressed her palms against her ears, but she could still hear him, could still feel the truth of his words resonating in places she'd forgotten existed. Just stop talking. Because if what he was saying was real, if she was who he claimed she was, then everything became impossible. The massacre at Millbrook hadn't been random violence. It had been an assassination attempt. Someone had found her after all these years of hiding, had sent soldiers to drag her back to face whatever fate her supposed family had died to prevent. And Kieran wasn't her enemy. He was her rescue. The thought terrified her more than any threat of execution could have. "I can't be a princess." The words tumbled out in a rush, raw with desperation. "Look at me. I'm nobody. I steal food from abandoned cabins. I haven't had a real bath in months. Princesses don't live like animals in the wilderness. Princesses who are hunted do," Kieran said quietly. "Princesses whose very existence threatens the legitimacy of whoever orchestrated their family's murder." Mira's legs finally gave out, and she sank onto the rough wooden bench beside the table, her whole body trembling. If she was Princess Mirabelle of Valdris, and the name felt like coming home and walking to the gallows all at once, then her mere survival was an act of treason against whoever now sat on her father's throne. "Who?" she asked, though she wasn't certain she wanted to know. "Who killed them?" Kieran's expression darkened, and for a moment she caught a glimpse of the legendary Alpha King she'd heard whispered about in taverns, the man whose very presence on a battlefield could turn the tide of wars. "That's complicated. The official story claims it was an internal rebellion. Nobles who felt your father was too weak, too willing to negotiate with neighboring kingdoms instead of conquering them. And the unofficial story? The unofficial story suggests someone wanted to unite the crowns of Valdris and Lunaris under a single ruler, someone who needed both royal bloodlines eliminated to make their claim legitimate. His amber eyes found hers, and she saw something that might have been regret flickering in their depths. someone who would benefit from a war between our kingdoms that left both weakened enough to be conquered. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Not just her family's death, but the years of conflict that had followed. The raids on border villages, the refugees streaming through the wilderness with hollow eyes and empty bellies, the systematic destruction of everything she'd thought was her life, all of it orchestrated by someone who saw kingdoms and bloodlines as pieces on a game board. "I don't want this," she whispered, staring at the pendant where it lay gleaming in the firelight. "I don't want to be her. I can't be what you need me to be." Because that's what this was really about, wasn't it? They didn't want Mira the herbalist, Mira the refugee, Mira who stole bread and slept in hollow trees. They wanted Princess Mirabelle, who could legitimize claims and unite kingdoms, and probably had opinions about trade agreements and military alliances. They wanted someone who could be a symbol, a figurehead, a solution to problems she'd never even known existed. "I'm not brave enough," she said, and the admission felt like tearing something vital from her chest. "I've spent 3 months running from everything. How could someone like me ever be strong enough to face the people who destroyed my family?" Kieran was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those impossibly knowing eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made her look up despite herself. "Perhaps," he said softly, "the question isn't whether you're brave enough to be a princess. Perhaps it's whether you're brave enough to stop running from who you've always been." The words settled into the silence like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything Mira thought she knew about herself. She stared at the pendant gleaming on the cabin floor, and for the first time in 3 months, maybe in her entire fabricated life, she stopped running. Not physically. She remained seated on the rough wooden bench, her hands trembling in her lap. But something deeper stilled, some fundamental part of her that had been in constant motion since the night Henrik pressed that traveling pack into her hands and pushed her toward a future built on lies. "I've been dreaming about a boy," she said quietly, the admission scraping her throat raw. "Green eyes. He used to braid flowers in my hair and tell me stories about dragons who hoarded books instead of gold." She looked up at Kieran, searching his face for confirmation she wasn't certain she wanted. "That was real, wasn't it?" "Adrian, your brother was famous for his love of stories, something that might have been a smile ghosted across Kieran's features, and for his absolute inability to sit still during formal court functions. Your mother used to say he had adventure in his blood." Your mother. Not Queen or Her Majesty, but your mother. As if Kieran had known her personally, had perhaps sat at her table and listened to her worry about her restless son and her daughter, who climbed trees in silk court dresses. The realization hit her with stunning clarity. You were there, in the palace, you knew them. I was barely more than a boy myself, but yes. Our kingdoms weren't always at war, Mira. There was a time when the royal families visited each other, when marriages were arranged to strengthen alliances rather than conquests planned to destroy them. His expression grew distant, weighted with memories. Your father was a good man. He believed peace was possible between our people. And someone had killed him for it, had murdered her mother, had tried to murder her and Adrian, all to prevent a future where wolves and humans might coexist without bloodshed. Mira closed her eyes, and for the first time since waking in that cottage 3 months ago, she stopped fighting the memories that wanted to surface. Let herself remember marble floors cool beneath bare feet, gardens that stretched toward horizons painted gold with sunset, a woman's voice singing lullabies about princesses who saved themselves. When she opened her eyes again, Kieran was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not pity. She would have recoiled from pity. Something deeper than sympathy, but gentler than expectation. If I'm really her, Mira said slowly, if I'm Princess Mirabelle, then staying hidden isn't just about protecting myself anymore, is it? No, he confirmed quietly. It isn't. Because there were others now. Other villages that might be attacked by people searching for her. Other innocent lives that would be lost in a war orchestrated by someone who needed both kingdoms weakened. Other refugees who would flee into wilderness that grew more dangerous with each passing season. And Adrian. Her brother, the words still felt impossible, was alive somewhere, searching for a sister who had spent 15 years hiding from the very family she'd thought was dead. The people who did this, she continued, her voice growing stronger despite the fear clawing at her chest. They won't stop, will they? Even if I disappear completely, even if I spend the rest of my life as Mira, nobody from nowhere. They can't afford to stop. Kieran's amber eyes held hers steadily. As long as you're alive, you're a threat to whatever they've built on your family's graves. And as long as they're searching for you, innocent people will suffer. The truth of it settled around her like armor, heavy, uncomfortable, but necessary. She could keep running, could disappear so completely that even her brother would never find her, could live out her days as a ghost haunting the edges of other people's lives. But the attacks would continue. The war would rage on. And somewhere, Adrian would spend his life searching for a sister who had chosen her own fear over the possibility of justice. Mira stood slowly, her legs steadier than they'd been in months. She crossed the small space to where the pendant lay and knelt to pick it up. The silver was warm against her palm, and the moment her skin made contact, something clicked into place inside her chest. Not memories exactly, something deeper than that. A sense of belonging that had nothing to do with crowns or kingdoms, and everything to do with finally stopping the constant flight from herself. If I do this, she said, straightening to face Kieran, if I become who you need me to be, there's no going back, is there? No, he said simply. There isn't. Mira nodded once, sharp and decisive, and clasped the pendant around her neck. The weight of it felt like an anchor, like a promise, like the first honest thing she'd worn in 15 years. Then I suppose, she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised them both, it's time to stop being afraid of coming home. The words had barely left her lips when the silence shattered. A low, resonant howl pierced the night air, not the wild, haunting call of a lone wolf, but something far more deliberate. A signal. Kieran's entire body went rigid, his hand moving instinctively to the sword at his hip. We need to leave. Now. His voice had transformed from gentle to commanding in the span of a heartbeat. That's a patrol signal. They've found us. Mira's fingers flew to the pendant at her throat, the silver suddenly feeling less like an anchor and more like a beacon. Who? The same people who... Move. Kieran was already across the cabin, dousing the fire with practiced efficiency. Questions later. Survival now. But even as Mira scrambled for the traveling pack she'd abandoned days ago, her mind raced with implications. Someone had tracked them here, to this isolated cabin in the deepest part of the Whispering Pines. Either they'd been followed, or her decision to reclaim her identity had somehow triggered consequences she couldn't yet comprehend. The howl came again, closer this time, followed by an answering call from the opposite direction. They were surrounded. There's a root cellar, Kieran said tersely, lifting a section of floorboard she hadn't noticed. It connects to a tunnel that leads. The cabin door exploded inward. 3 figures in dark clothing poured through the opening, moving with inhuman speed and grace. Not soldiers, something far more dangerous. Mira caught a glimpse of pale skin, elongated canines, and eyes that reflected the dying firelight like mirrors. Vampires. Kieran's sword sang as it cleared its sheath, the blade gleaming with an inner light that made the intruders hiss and recoil. Lady Seraphine, he said, his tone conversational despite the mortal danger radiating from every line of his body. I should have known you'd be involved in this. The center figure pushed back her hood, revealing aristocratic features and silver hair that moved like liquid mercury. When she smiled, her fangs gleamed like pearls. Alpha King, how delightful to see you again. And you've brought us such a precious gift. Her gaze fixed on Mira with predatory hunger, and suddenly the pendant felt burning hot against her skin. The lost princess, Seraphine continued, taking a step forward that made Kieran's blade rise in warning. Do you know how many years we've searched for you, little bird? How many villages we've had to interrogate? The massacre at Millbrook. These creatures had been the ones asking questions, seeking information, leaving death in their wake. Mira felt something sharp and cold unfurl in her chest. Not fear, but fury. You killed Henrik, she said, her voice steady despite the way her hands shook. You killed all of them. Such a sentimental attachment to cattle. Seraphine's laugh was like breaking glass. Though I admit the old man was remarkably stubborn, it took considerable persuasion to make him reveal your true nature. Henrik had known, had died protecting her secret, buying her time to escape. The man she'd thought was simply a kind baker had sacrificed everything to keep her safe, and these monsters spoke of his death like it was amusing entertainment. The fury in her chest blazed higher, and something impossible happened. The pendant grew so hot it should have burned her skin, but instead of pain, she felt power flooding through her veins like molten silver. The air around her began to shimmer. Fascinating, Seraphine breathed, her eyes widening with something that might have been hunger or fear. She's awakening. No wonder our employer is so eager to claim her. Your employer can go to hell, Kieran snarled, moving to place himself between Mira and the vampires. She's under my protection now. Protection? One of the other vampires, a thin man with dead eyes, tilted his head with mock curiosity. From the Alpha King whose armies slaughtered her village. How wonderfully ironic. We didn't... Kieran began, but Mira stepped forward, the words dying as she moved past him. The shimmer in the air intensified, and she felt something vast and ancient stirring inside her consciousness. Not memories this time, but something far more primal, magic that had been sleeping in her bloodline for generations, waiting for the moment when royal blood and desperate need aligned. Tell me who sent you, she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the cabin walls vibrate. Tell me who wants me dead. Seraphine's smile faltered. Child, you have no idea what forces you're meddling with. Come quietly, and your death will be swift. Continue this display and... I said, tell me. The pendant blazed like a star against Mira's throat, and the vampire took an involuntary step backward. The true king, Seraphine hissed. The one who will unite both kingdoms under a single crown. The one who has waited 20 years for this moment. The words hit Mira like physical blows, but she didn't retreat. Couldn't retreat. Because finally, she understood what she was truly fighting against. Someone who had orchestrated her family's death wasn't content to simply rule Valdris. They wanted everything. Both kingdoms, both thrones, an empire built on the bones of everyone who might oppose them, and they needed her bloodline erased to make it legitimate. Then you can tell your king, Mira said, power crackling around her like lightning, that Princess Mirabelle sends her regards. The moment Mira spoke her true name, the world exploded into chaos. The power that had been building inside her erupted outward in a wave of silver light that sent the vampires stumbling backward, their faces contorted in pain. Seraphine shrieked, a sound like metal tearing, as the radiance washed over her, leaving angry red welts across her pale skin. But the reprieve lasted only seconds. As the light faded, the vampires regrouped with predatory fury, and Mira felt the magic drain from her like water through a broken dam. Her legs buckled, but Kieran's strong arm caught her before she could fall. The tunnel, he said urgently, already pulling her toward the open root cellar. Now, while they're recovering. But Seraphine was faster than the light that had burned her. She appeared between them and their escape route, her aristocratic features twisted with rage and something that might have been respect. Remarkable, the vampire breathed, flexing clawed fingers. Royal blood magic, awakened by desperation and fury. Our employer will be so pleased to add your power to his collection. Over my dead body, Kieran snarled, his sword blazing with renewed intensity. Seraphine's laugh was poison honey. That can certainly be arranged, Alpha King. Though it seems a waste. You could join us willingly. Think of what we could accomplish together. Your strength, our immortality, and her. She gestured toward Mira with naked hunger. Her delicious royal essence. Mira felt bile rise in her throat. Not just at the threat, but at the casual way these creatures spoke of using her, consuming her, adding her power to someone else's arsenal. She'd spent 15 years being shaped into what others needed her to be. First the false identity Henrik had crafted, then the refugee who survived on scraps and desperation. And now they wanted to remake her again into some kind of magical battery for their mysterious king. No. The word came out stronger than she felt, backed by a lifetime of being told who she should be. I'm not your weapon. I'm not anyone's weapon. The pendant pulsed against her throat, and she felt the magic stirring again. Not the explosive burst from before, but something steadier, more controlled, as if her refusal had awakened not just power but purpose. Kieran glanced at her, surprise flickering across his features before transforming into something that looked almost like pride. Together, he said quietly, and it wasn't a command or a plea. It was an offer. Partnership. Not him protecting the helpless princess, not her cowering while others fought for her life. Together, as equals choosing to stand against the darkness that had already claimed too many innocent lives. Mira nodded once, feeling the magic settle into her bones like coming home. They moved as one, Kieran's blade singing through the air toward the thin vampire, while Mira focused on Seraphine, silver light wreathing her hands like controlled flame. The remaining vampire lunged toward the tunnel opening, clearly intent on cutting off their retreat, but Kieran's warning growl sent him scrambling backward. For a moment, they held their ground, steel and starlight against fang and claw, the cabin filling with the crash of battle and the smell of ozone from Mira's growing power. She felt herself changing with each heartbeat, not just the magic awakening, but something deeper. The frightened refugee who had broken into this cabin was burning away, leaving someone she didn't quite recognize yet, someone who could fight back. But they were still outnumbered, and vampires were faster than human reflexes could track. Seraphine's claws raked across Kieran's shoulder, drawing blood that gleamed black in the silver light. The thin vampire's fangs found purchase on Mira's wrist before she could pull away, sending ice-cold pain shooting up her arm. Worse, she could feel him drinking. Not just blood, but something far more precious, the magic itself, flowing out of her like a tide. Royal essence, Seraphine purred as Mira's knees hit the cabin floor. Even more intoxicating than we hoped. Kieran roared, a sound more wolf than man, and his sword found the thin vampire's heart. The creature crumbled to dust, releasing Mira from his draining grip, but she could feel how much strength she'd already lost. The pendant still pulsed with warmth, but the silver light around her hands had dimmed to barely a glow. They couldn't win this fight. Not here, not like this, not when every moment of contact gave their enemies access to the very power she was still learning to control. But as Seraphine advanced with renewed confidence, Mira realized something that changed everything. The vampire wasn't just hunting her for some mysterious king's collection. She was enjoying this, the fear, the desperation, the slow drain of hope from her victim's eyes. These creatures had tortured Henrik for information, had murdered innocent villagers while searching for clues, had spent years leaving death and terror in their wake, all in service to someone who saw kingdoms as possessions to be acquired. Mira's fury blazed back to life, and with it came a terrible clarity. She might not be ready to fight for crowns or kingdoms or the political futures of realms she barely understood, but she was absolutely ready to fight for the people who had already died because of her existence. The fury burning through Mira's veins transformed into something she'd never felt before. Not just anger, but righteous wrath that seemed to ignite every cell in her body. The pendant against her throat blazed like a fallen star, and suddenly the magic wasn't something foreign flowing through her. It was her, as much a part of her royal blood as the memories that were flooding back with crystalline clarity. She remembered her mother's hands teaching her to weave light into healing salves. Her father's voice explaining that true power wasn't about dominion, but protection. Adrian showing her how to call starlight to dance in her palms during long winter nights, when the palace felt too large and lonely. You want my essence? Mira pushed herself to her feet, silver fire wreathing her entire body now. Then take it. She opened herself completely to the power, letting it pour out of her in torrents. But instead of the controlled streams Seraphine expected to drain, it erupted like a supernova. The vampire shrieked as royal magic flooded into her, too pure and blazing for her undead system to process. Where vampires fed on life force slowly, savoring the gradual drain of their victims, this was like trying to swallow the sun. Seraphine convulsed, silver light pouring from her eyes and mouth, her perfect aristocratic features contorting in agony. Impossible, she gasped, her voice fracturing. You're killing yourself. No royal bloodline can channel this much. I'm not just any royal bloodline, Mira said, and finally understood what Kieran had been trying to tell her about her mother's legacy. Not just human royalty, but something older. Something that had been bred specifically to bridge the gap between mortal and magical realms. I'm the daughter of Queen Isadora the Starweaver. The remaining vampire turned to flee, but Kieran's blade found him before he could reach the shattered door. The Alpha King moved like liquid death, his own power awakening in response to Mira's display, not competing with her magic, but harmonizing with it. Wolf and starlight, predator and protector. Two forces that should have been opposites but somehow created perfect balance. Seraphine collapsed to her knees, the stolen magic burning her from the inside. You don't understand what you've done, she wheezed. He's been preparing for 20 years, building an army. Your brother, your precious brother, walks right into his trap. What do you mean? Mira demanded, but Seraphine was already crumbling, her form dissolving into ash that scattered in the wind pouring through the broken doorway. The sudden silence felt deafening. Mira swayed on her feet, the magical expenditure leaving her hollowed out and shaking, but alive. More than alive. Awakened. The power still hummed in her veins, no longer foreign but as natural as breathing. Kieran caught her as her knees buckled, his warm arms steadying her against his chest. She could feel his heart hammering, could smell blood from the wounds Seraphine had left across his shoulder and neck. You're hurt, she said, lifting trembling hands to examine the claw marks. I'll heal. His amber eyes searched her face intently. But what you just did should have killed you. That much magic, unleashed all at once. But it didn't. Mira touched the pendant, which had cooled to its normal silver warmth. Because this isn't just about remembering who I was. It's about becoming who I'm meant to be. The truth of it settled around them both like dawn breaking. She wasn't the helpless princess who needed rescuing, or the frightened refugee who survived on scraps and prayers. She was something new, someone who could stand between innocent people and the darkness that hunted them. Someone who could fight back, but Seraphine's final words echoed in her mind like a death knell. Your brother walks right into his trap. We have to warn Adrian, she said urgently, pulling back to meet Kieran's gaze. If this mysterious king has been planning for 20 years, if he has an army, we will. Kieran's voice carried absolute certainty. But first, we need to get you somewhere safe. That display will have been felt for miles. Every magical creature in the Whispering Pines knows exactly where we are now. As if summoned by his words, howls began echoing through the forest. Not the controlled signals from before, but wild hunting calls from things that had never been human. The scent of smoke and sulfur drifted through the broken door, and somewhere in the distance, trees began to fall with thunderous crashes. Mira felt her newly awakened power stirring in response to the approaching threats, eager to meet them with starlight and fury. But she also felt something else, a bone-deep understanding that this was only the beginning. She'd chosen to stop running, to embrace her destiny as Princess Mirabelle. But the girl who had made that choice in the warmth and safety of the cabin was gone forever. The woman who would face what came next was someone else entirely. The first wave of creatures reached them before they'd made it 50 yards from the cabin. Mira had expected more vampires, or perhaps the shadow wolves that had been tracking them. Instead, what emerged from the tree line made her blood turn to ice. Wraiths, incorporeal beings of pure malevolence that fed on despair itself. Their translucent forms moved like smoke given murderous purpose, and where they touched the snow, it blackened and died. They're drawn to royal magic, Kieran said grimly, his sword useless against enemies that had no physical form. The more power you use, the more of them will come. The terrible irony wasn't lost on her. The magic that had just saved them from the vampires was now a beacon calling every dark thing in the forest to their location. And without her power, they were just two people with conventional weapons facing creatures that existed beyond the reach of steel and determination. Mira tried to summon the silver fire again, but her reserves were dangerously depleted. The pendant gave off only the faintest glow, and when she reached for the starlight magic, pain lanced through her skull like lightning. Using so much power at once had consequences, ones that were becoming devastatingly clear as the wraiths circled closer. "The tunnel," Kieran said. But when they turned back toward the cabin, more shapes were emerging from the woods. Not wraiths this time, something worse. Bone collectors, their skeletal frames wreathed in strips of rotting flesh, carrying crude weapons forged from the remains of their victims. They were trapped. Mira felt despair creeping in at the edges of her consciousness. Not her own emotion, but something the wraiths were projecting, feeding it into her mind like poison. Images flashed through her thoughts. Adrian walking unknowing into an ambush, his armies cut down by some mysterious king's forces. Kieran's blood staining the snow as bone collectors tore him apart. Her own magic consumed by creatures that would use it to bring more death to the world. "No," she whispered. But the word came out weak, uncertain. The wraiths pressed closer, their presence making the very air feel thick with hopelessness. Then she heard it, a howl that cut through the supernatural despair like a blade. But not from the creatures surrounding them. From deeper in the forest, growing closer with each passing second. "Adrian," Kieran breathed, recognition dawning in his eyes. "He's here." Relief flooded through Mira so powerfully it momentarily pushed back the wraith's influence. Her brother had come for her, just as she'd known he would. They wouldn't die alone in this cursed forest after all. But as the howls grew louder, she realized something that turned her relief to horror. Adrian was charging toward them at full speed, unaware of the trap waiting. The magical signature from her battle with the vampires would have been impossible for him to miss, but it would also have masked the presence of the creatures now surrounding them. He was riding straight into an ambush, exactly as Seraphine had warned. "We have to stop him," Mira said desperately, trying again to summon her magic. This time she managed to produce a flickering silver glow, but the effort left her swaying on her feet. "If he gets caught in this—" "He's not alone," Kieran said, his enhanced hearing picking up sounds she couldn't detect. "At least 24 riders, maybe more, but it won't matter against this many wraiths." The bone collectors had crept close enough that Mira could smell the grave dirt clinging to their remains. One of them, wearing the tattered remnants of what might once have been a royal guard's uniform, raised a sword made from sharpened femurs and pointed directly at her. They knew who she was, what she represented. The princess whose bloodline could legitimize a conqueror's claim to 2 kingdoms, or whose death would clear the path for someone else's ascension to power. "Your Highness," the creature spoke in a voice like grinding bone, "our master extends his invitation to join him willingly. Refuse, and your brother's army becomes the foundation of our ranks." Adrian was close enough now that she could hear individual hoofbeats, could make out the battle cries of his soldiers as they prepared to charge into what they thought was a rescue mission. In moments, they would be within range of the wraith's despair magic, their minds clouded just as hers had been, unable to think clearly enough to mount an effective defense. Mira looked at the pendant in her hands, her mother's final gift, the key to magic that could reshape kingdoms. Then she looked at Kieran, whose amber eyes held no judgment, only acceptance of whatever choice she was about to make. Finally, she looked toward the sound of approaching hoofbeats, toward the brother who had spent 3 months searching for her, never giving up hope that she might still be alive. The creatures were right. She could surrender herself, and perhaps buy time for Adrian and his soldiers to escape. Or she could fight with what little power remained, and watch everyone she cared about die in the attempt to save her. Either way, she was about to lose everything that mattered. The bone collector's empty eye sockets fixed on her face, waiting for an answer that would determine the fate of 2 kingdoms. And Mira realized she was out of miracles. The pendant against Mira's throat suddenly blazed with heat so intense she gasped, stumbling backward into Kieran's steadying grip. But this wasn't her magic responding. This was something else entirely. The silver grew so hot it should have burned her skin. Yet instead of pain, she felt a strange resonance, like an echo calling to something buried deep in her memory. "Not your miracles, little star. Mine." The voice whispered through her mind with crystalline clarity, not her own thoughts, but words spoken in a tone she'd dreamed about for 15 years. Warm honey and starlight. Fierce love wrapped in absolute authority. Her mother's voice. "Impossible," Mira breathed. But even as she spoke, the pendant's heat was spreading through her body in waves. Not the wild, explosive power she'd wielded against the vampires, but something infinitely more controlled, more ancient, magic that felt less like fire and more like the slow, inevitable turning of the stars themselves. The wraiths shrieked and recoiled as silver radiance began pouring from the pendant, but this light was different from anything Mira had produced before. It carried memory within its brilliance, images that flooded her consciousness so vividly they might have been happening in the present moment. Queen Isidora standing in a moonlit chamber, pouring her essence into the pendant, while tears streamed down her face. If something happens to me, this will find its way to you when you need it most. Not just my magic, beloved, but my memories. The truth they'll try to hide from you. Mother, Mira whispered. And suddenly she wasn't standing in a snow-covered clearing surrounded by monsters. She was 7 years old again, watching her mother's final preparations before the assassination attempt that would steal both their lives. Or so the world believed. The pendant doesn't just hold power, Isidora's voice continued, clear as if she stood beside them. It holds knowledge. Everything I learned about the conspiracy that threatens our bloodline. Everything you'll need to know to stop him. The images cascaded faster now. Her father meeting in secret with men whose faces were hidden by shadow magic. Their voices distorted but their intent crystal clear. A coup 20 years in the making, orchestrated not by foreign enemies, but by someone within their own court. Someone who had been patient enough to wait decades for the perfect moment to strike. Someone who needed both royal bloodlines eliminated before he could claim legitimate rule. Mira gasped, as understanding crashed over her like ice water. The mysterious king who had sent vampires and bone collectors wasn't some foreign conqueror. He was family, someone who had attended her 7th birthday celebration, who had stood at her parents' funeral pyre wearing an expression of perfectly crafted grief. Lord Commander Cassius Drakemore, Isidora's memories supplied. Your father's trusted advisor, your uncle's dearest friend, Adrian's mentor in the art of war. The man who had trained Adrian in combat strategy was the same man now laying traps for him. Kieran's sharp intake of breath told her that somehow he was seeing the memories too, the pendant's magic weaving them into a shared vision. The Northern Campaign, he said grimly. Adrian's been following intelligence provided by his advisors. If Drakemore has been feeding him false information, he's not riding to rescue me, Mira finished, horror crystallizing in her chest. He's riding into the final phase of a 20-year plan to eliminate everyone with a legitimate claim to the throne. The bone collector that had spoken tilted its skull, empty sockets somehow conveying cruel amusement. You understand at last. Lord Commander Drakemore sends his greetings, Highness. He's quite eager to reunite with his beloved ward. Prince Adrian has grown so strong under his tutelage. Strong enough to make his inevitable fall all the more spectacular. Thunder of hoofbeats grew deafening, close enough now that Mira could make out individual voices shouting orders. Adrian's voice among them, commanding his soldiers to form ranks for a charge that would drive them straight into the center of the trap. But the pendant's heat hadn't faded. If anything, it was growing stronger, and with it came more of her mother's memories. Not just the conspiracy's scope, but Queen Isidora's desperate preparations to stop it. I couldn't save your father, the voice whispered. But I made sure you would have everything needed to save your brother. Not just power, darling. Understanding. The knowledge of what Drakemore truly is, and the one weakness he spent 2 decades trying to hide. Images flashed, ancient texts describing bloodline magic, genealogy charts tracing power through generations, and finally, devastatingly, the truth about Drakemore's own heritage. Why he needed both siblings dead before he could claim the throne without challenge. Why he'd spent 20 years building an army of undead rather than risking open warfare. Mira's eyes snapped open, meeting Kieran's stunned gaze as the revelation settled between them like a blade. He's not fully human, she said. That's why he needs our deaths to look like enemy action. Why he's using creatures of darkness instead of conventional forces. The truth would change everything, if they lived long enough to act on it. The knowledge crystallized in Mira's mind like ice forming on still water, devastating and beautiful and utterly clear. Her mother's memories showed her the final pieces, genealogy charts that traced Drakemore's lineage not to human nobility, but to something far older and more dangerous. A bloodline that had been carefully hidden for generations, diluted through strategic marriages until only the faintest trace remained. Enough to grant him extended life and command over undead creatures. Not enough to legitimize his claim to a throne built on pure human magical bloodlines. A vampire lord, Kieran breathed, understanding flickering in his amber eyes. Not turned, but born. That's why he needs you and Adrian eliminated through warfare instead of simple assassination. Any death that could be traced back to him would reveal what he truly is. The bone collectors were advancing again, but Mira barely noticed. Power was flowing through the pendant in steady waves now. Not her depleted reserves, but her mother's carefully stored essence, awakening only when the truth was finally understood. And with that power came something more precious than magic, a plan. He has one weakness, Isadora's voice whispered. The same thing that makes him powerful makes him vulnerable. Vampire nobility cannot maintain their armies without a steady source of pure blood. That's why he's kept Adrian alive this long, not just to eliminate a threat, but to harvest what he needs to maintain control. The trap, Mira said suddenly, the strategy becoming clear. He's not trying to kill Adrian quickly. He needs him alive long enough to... She couldn't finish the thought. The image of her brother being slowly drained while Drakemore's undead army fed on his life force was too horrific to voice. But Kieran understood. Which means we have time. Not much, but enough to turn his own strategy against him. The thunder of hoofbeats was almost upon them now. Adrian's voice rose above the battle cries, sharp with command and edged with desperate hope. "Mira, if you can hear me, we're coming." Her brother, who had searched for her across 3 kingdoms and through the worst winter in decades, who had never stopped believing she might still be alive, even when all evidence suggested otherwise, who was about to ride straight into the culmination of a conspiracy that had already claimed their parents' lives, not if she could help it. "The forest magic," she said suddenly, turning to Kieran with newfound determination. "You said the whispering pines respond to your wolf nature. Can you call to them, make them answer? In limited ways, yes. But against this many creatures, not against them. For us." The plan was crystallizing, built from her mother's memories and her own growing understanding of how magic truly worked. Drakemore's creatures are powered by death energy. They're antithetical to living magic. If we could turn the entire forest against them... Kieran's eyes widened as he grasped her meaning. The trees, the earth, even the snow itself. But it would require more power than either of us has left. "Not either of us," Mira said, her hand closing around the pendant. "Both of us. Together." She'd felt it during the fight with the vampires, the way their magic had harmonized instead of competing. Wolf and starlight, predator and protector, creating something stronger than the sum of its parts. Her mother's memories showed similar pairings throughout history. Bloodline magic that worked not in isolation, but in perfect balance with its complement. "You're talking about a true magical bond," Kieran said quietly. "Once formed, it can't be undone, ever. You'd be tied to me for life. Your magic, your essence, everything that makes you who you are." The bone collectors were close enough to strike now, their makeshift weapons raised. Behind them, the wraiths circled like smoke given predatory purpose. And beyond the clearing, Adrian's forces were moments away from charging into a trap, 20 years in the making. Mira looked at Kieran, really looked at him, the Alpha King who had found her stealing scraps from his table and chosen mercy over judgment, who had protected her when she was weak, stood beside her when she was strong, and was now offering to bind his very soul to hers for the sake of people he'd never met. "There are worse fates," she said simply, extending her hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady and absolutely certain. The moment their skin touched, power exploded between them, not the wild, uncontrolled magic from before, but something infinitely more refined. Silver starlight wound through golden wolf fire, creating patterns that seemed to rewrite the very air around them. The forest answered their call like a lover recognizing their beloved's voice. Trees that had stood silent for centuries groaned to wakefulness. Snow that had lain still as death began to swirl with purpose. Even the stones beneath their feet hummed with sudden, overwhelming life. The bone collectors shrieked as living vines burst from the frozen ground to entangle their skeletal forms. Wraiths found themselves trapped in cages of silver-touched light that burned away their incorporeal substance, like morning mist. And in the distance, Mira felt her brother's approach. But now she also felt the trap waiting for him, the careful positioning of enemies that had been invisible moments before. Now, she said. Together they reached out with their combined power and began to even the odds. The combined magic of wolf and starlight reached across the whispering pines like wildfire. But instead of destruction, it brought awakening. Every tree, every buried root, every dormant seed beneath the snow responded to their call with an eagerness that spoke of centuries of waiting for this moment. Mira felt the forest's consciousness brush against hers, ancient, patient, and absolutely furious at the presence of undead creatures poisoning its sacred groves. Through the magical bond thrumming between her and Kieran, she sensed his wonder as the trees began sharing their memories, glimpses of Drakemore's forces moving through the darkness, setting traps, corrupting everything they touched with death magic. The bone collector's shrieks turned to screams of genuine terror as massive oak roots erupted from the frozen ground, moving with serpentine grace to crush their brittle forms. One creature, the former royal guard who had spoken with such arrogance, found itself lifted 50 feet into the air by a pine tree that had suddenly decided to rearrange its branches. The satisfying crunch of ancient bones echoed through the clearing. But even as they cleared the immediate area, Mira's awareness stretched further through their bond with the forest. She could feel Adrian's army thundering closer, could sense the invisible net of wraiths and worse things waiting in the shadows beyond the clearing. Drakemore hadn't just planned an ambush, he'd orchestrated a massacre. "There," Kieran said grimly, his enhanced senses picking up what the trees were showing them. 3 more clusters of bone collectors positioned along Adrian's route. And something else. His grip on her hand tightened. "Mira, there are vampires moving parallel to your brother's forces. Not the mindless ones we fought before. These feel older, stronger." Through her mother's memories, she understood. Drakemore's inner circle, the vampire nobles who had helped orchestrate her family's downfall, they would be the ones to capture Adrian alive, to ensure he survived long enough for whatever horrific ritual Drakemore had planned. "We can reach them," she said, feeling the forest's eagerness to help. "But we'll have to split our focus. The trees can handle the bone collectors, but the vampires are mine," Kieran finished, wolf fire blazing in his eyes. "My pack taught me how to hunt bloodsuckers long before I knew what politics was." The magical bond between them pulsed with shared determination and something deeper, trust so complete it took her breath away. In the space of heartbeats, they had become something new, not just Princess and Alpha King, but partners in the truest sense. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Adrian's voice rang out through the trees, closer now, edged with concern. "Mira, the forest, something's happening." She almost smiled, despite their dire circumstances. Her brother had always been sensitive to magic, even if he couldn't wield it himself. He would be feeling the awakening of the whispering pines like electricity in the air. "Time to even those odds," Kieran said. They reached out together, their combined will flowing through root and branch and stone. Ancient spruces bent impossible ways to form barriers across hidden ravines where more undead waited. Streams that had been frozen solid suddenly broke free of their icy constraints, rushing forward to wash away carefully laid bone traps. Even the snow itself became a weapon, swirling into dense walls that would confuse and separate Drakemore's forces. But as their magic stretched across miles of forest, Mira felt something that made her blood freeze. At the very edge of their awareness, where the trees grew thin and rocky ground marked the border with the northern kingdoms, stood a presence that radiated cold malevolence. Drakemore himself, watching, waiting, and he wasn't alone. "He knows," she whispered, horror creeping through the bond. Through the tree's ancient sight, she could see him clearly for the first time, tall and aristocratic, wearing the face of the trusted advisor who had comforted her after nightmares, who had taught Adrian to hold a sword. But his eyes held the accumulated hunger of centuries and the cruel satisfaction of a predator, whose trap was finally springing closed. Behind him stood figures in elaborate armor that seemed to drink in light, vampire lords old enough to remember the founding of kingdoms. And at his side, wearing chains that glowed with binding magic, was a figure that made Kieran snarl with rage. "Seraphine," he breathed. "That bastard has Seraphine." The vampire queen who had warned them, who had tried to save them, hung limp in magical restraints. Her capture hadn't been chance. It had been punishment for her betrayal of Drakemore's cause. Through the forest's awareness, Mira watched Drakemore raise one pale hand. Even at this distance, she felt his power gathering. Death magic on a scale that dwarfed anything they had faced so far. He's not just after Adrian, she realized with dawning horror. He's going to turn this entire forest into a weapon. Everyone here, Adrian's army, us, even his own creatures, we're all just fuel for whatever spell he's casting. The final confrontation wasn't approaching. It had already begun. The moment Drakemore's power began gathering, the very trees screamed. Mira felt their agony through the bond as death magic slammed into the forest's awakened consciousness, like acid poured on living flesh. Ancient oaks that had stood for centuries withered at their edges. Streams that moments ago had rushed with newfound life began to stagnate and turn black. "He's using the forest against itself," Kieran snarled, his wolf nature reacting violently to the corruption, spreading through their magical connection. "The bigger our network, the more he can poison." But even as the realization hit them, Mira felt something else stirring, something her mother's memories had prepared her for but hadn't fully explained. The pendant against her chest wasn't just warming now, it was burning with silver fire that seemed to push back the encroaching darkness. "Now you understand," Isadora's voice whispered through the magic. "Why I bound my essence to starlight itself, not just royal bloodline power. Drakemore can corrupt living magic, bend it to his will, but he cannot touch the light of stars. They burn too pure, too distant from earthly concerns." "The starlight," Mira breathed, understanding flooding through her. "Mother didn't just give me her power, she gave me something he can't corrupt." Through their bond, she felt Kieran's fierce satisfaction as he grasped the implications. But there was something else in his emotions, a terrible resolve that made her stomach clench. "What are you planning?" she demanded. His amber eyes met hers, and she saw the Alpha King who had united 12 fractious packs through sheer force of will. "You can't channel starlight through a corrupted network. The forest connection is compromised, but a true mate bond isn't. Kieran, no. If you try to channel that much power through yourself, I'm not just any werewolf, princess." His smile was sharp and sad and absolutely certain. "I'm the Alpha King. My body was made to handle impossible forces." Before she could protest further, he pulled her closer, his free hand cupping her face with infinite gentleness. Around them, the corruption was spreading faster, turning their beautiful network of awakened trees into a weapon of mass destruction that would consume Adrian's army along with everything else in its path. "Trust me," he said simply, and despite every logical protest screaming in her mind, she did. Mira reached deep into the pendant's burning core and found her mother's starlight waiting. Not the diluted power she'd been accessing before, but the full devastating force of celestial magic that had once made Queen Isadora the most feared battle mage in 3 kingdoms. Power that existed beyond earthly corruption, pure as vacuum and twice as deadly. She opened herself to it completely. The silver fire that erupted from the pendant wasn't magic anymore. It was concentrated starlight given physical form, and it burned through Drakemore's corruption like a sword through silk. But channeling that much celestial force would have torn her apart in seconds, if not for Kieran's strength flowing through their bond, his wolf nature somehow tempering the wildness of distant stars into something she could actually control. The effect on the forest was immediate and breathtaking. Trees that had been withering under death magic suddenly blazed with silver light, their branches reaching skyward as if trying to touch the stars themselves. The corrupted streams cleared in rushing waves of liquid starlight. Even the snow began to glow, each flake catching and reflecting the celestial fire until the entire forest looked like a piece of heaven brought to earth. But more importantly, the network was theirs again. purified and stronger than ever. Through the tree's awareness, Mira felt Drakemore's shock, as his grand spell shattered against starlight that acknowledged no earthly master. She saw him stagger, his carefully gathered power dissipating like smoke, his vampire lords falling back in alarm. Impossible, his voice carried across the miles, no longer smooth and controlled but raw with fury. That power died with Isadora. Think again, Uncle, Mira whispered, and put everything she had learned into what came next. The awakened forest didn't just respond to their call now, it sang. Every tree, every root, every living thing in a 50-mile radius became an extension of their combined will. Adrian's approaching army found the very ground beneath their feet, reshaping itself, creating natural fortifications and clear paths toward their enemies. The remaining bone collectors dissolved under concentrated starlight. Wraiths fled shrieking back to whatever dark realm had spawned them, and the vampire lords who had thought to capture a prince found themselves facing an entire forest that had decided they weren't welcome. But as their power reached its crescendo, Mira felt Drakemore pulling back, not retreating, but gathering himself for something different, something that made the pendant burn even hotter against her chest. He's not done, she realized with growing dread. This was just the opening move. Through the trees, she watched Drakemore raise his chained prisoner, and Seraphine's agonized scream echoed across the night as ancient vampire blood began to power a spell that would make his first attempt look like a child's game. The real test was about to begin. The scream that tore from Seraphine's throat wasn't just pain. It was the sound of centuries-old vampire essence being forcibly extracted, refined into raw magical fuel. Through the forest's network, Mira watched in horror as Drakemore's spell began taking shape around the captive vampire queen, dark energy coiling like living shadow. He's going to burn her out completely, Kieran snarled, his wolf instincts recognizing the torture for what it was. Ancient vampire blood holds enough power to tear a hole between realms, Mira finished, her mother's memory supplying the terrifying conclusion. He's not trying to corrupt our magic anymore. He's opening a gateway to the shadow realm itself. The implications hit her, like a physical blow. The undead creatures they'd fought so far were nothing compared to what dwelt in that lightless dimension. If Drakemore succeeded in tearing open a permanent portal, armies of wraiths and bone collectors would pour through, enough to overwhelm every kingdom in Valdris. Through their bond, she felt Kieran's grim determination. Then we stop him, whatever it takes. The starlight might not be enough, she said, even as she began gathering power again. Not against something that fundamental. We're talking about the fabric of reality itself. Then we don't fight the spell, Kieran said suddenly, his strategic mind finding angles she'd missed. We fight him. Directly. Mira's breath caught as she understood. Drakemore was channeling the gateway spell through his own essence, using Seraphine's stolen power as fuel, but his own ancient will as the conduit. If they could break his concentration at the critical moment, it would mean leaving the forest network, she said. Going to him ourselves, without the tree's protection. Adrian's army is backup. Kieran's smile was all predator now. Your brother's closer than Drakemore realizes. The trees have been hiding their advance. Through the awakened forest, Mira reached out to find her brother's forces. Adrian rode at the head of 200 knights, their armor gleaming in the starlight, emanating from every branch and leaf. But more than that, she could feel his determination like a beacon, his absolute refusal to lose her again burning bright as any magic. Together then, she said, making the choice that would define everything to come. They began moving through the forest network itself, their consciousness flowing from tree to tree, while their physical forms dissolved into starlight and wolf fire. It was a technique that should have been impossible. Living beings weren't meant to travel as pure magical essence, but their bond made them something new, something that operated by different rules entirely. Behind them, the whispering pines continued their work. Ancient spruces formed protective corridors for Adrian's advancing knights. Streams of liquid starlight carved paths through the remaining clusters of undead. Even the rocky ground itself shifted to create advantageous positions for the coming battle. But ahead, Drakemore's gateway spell was reaching critical mass. They materialized at the edge of a barren clearing where no trees would grow, their bodies reforming from magic and moonlight and absolute determination. 50 yards away, Lord Drakemore stood at the center of a ritual circle carved into the stone itself, his hands raised toward a tear in the air that pulsed with otherworldly darkness. Seraphine hung suspended above the growing portal, her vampire essence being steadily drained to fuel the spell. Her eyes met Mira's across the clearing, and despite her agony, she managed to mouth a single word: "Now. Stop." Mira's voice rang with royal command and starlight power combined. "Release her, Drakemore. This ends tonight." The vampire lord, who had once been her father's trusted advisor, turned slowly, his aristocratic features twisted with centuries of hunger and ambition. "Princess Mirabelle, how lovely that you've come to witness the dawn of a new age." "The only thing dawning here is your defeat," Kieran growled, positioning himself between Mira and the growing portal. Wolf fire blazed around him like armor made of liquid gold. Drakemore laughed, the sound echoing strangely off the tear in reality behind him. "You understand nothing. I have spent 20 years preparing for this moment. Every death, every betrayal, every carefully laid plan has brought me here. You cannot stop what is already—" His words cut off abruptly as Adrian's war horn sounded from the forest edge. Through the trees came the thunder of hoofbeats and the battle cries of knights who had ridden, through hell itself, to reach this moment. "You were saying?" Mira asked sweetly, silver fire beginning to dance around her hands. For the first time since she'd known him, Drakemore's perfect composure cracked. His gaze flicked between her starlight, Kieran's wolf fire, the approaching army, and the portal that hung half-formed behind him, still hungry for the power needed to complete its manifestation. "Very well," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried across the clearing. "If you insist on dying together, I shall accommodate you." He released Seraphine and directed every ounce of her stolen essence directly at them. The wave of stolen vampire essence struck like a tsunami of liquid darkness, carrying within it the accumulated power of Seraphine's ancient bloodline. Mira barely had time to throw up a shield of starlight before the force slammed into them, driving her to her knees on the rocky ground. Kieran's wolf fire blazed brighter as he absorbed what he could of the impact, but she felt his pain through their bond. The death magic was antithetical to everything he was, burning through his natural defenses like acid. "You always were too trusting, little princess," Drakemore said, his voice carrying across the clearing as he began weaving the stolen power into something new. "Did you think I would simply duel you honorably? I learned centuries ago that honor is a luxury the victorious dead cannot afford." Through her mother's memories, Mira recognized the spell he was casting, not just death magic, but something worse, soul severance. If it struck true, it would tear apart the bond between her and Kieran, leaving them both powerless and broken. But as Drakemore raised his hands to complete the casting, Adrian's voice rang out from the tree line. "Sister!" Her brother burst into the clearing at the head of his knights, his sword already singing through the air toward Drakemore's position. Behind him rode Sir Thane and 200 of Valdris's finest warriors, their battle cry echoing off the rocky walls. For a heartbeat, hope flared in Mira's chest. They had him now, outnumbered, surrounded, with his grand portal spell interrupted by the need to defend himself. Then Drakemore smiled. "Perfect timing," he murmured, and spoke a single word in the ancient tongue. The half-formed gateway behind him pulsed once, and shadow wraiths began pouring through the incomplete tier. Dozens of them, then hundreds, not the mindless creatures they'd faced before, but the elite guard of the Shadow Realm itself, armed with weapons that could cut through steel and flesh alike. Adrian's charge faltered, as his knights found themselves facing an army of nightmares. Steel rang against spectral blades as mortal warriors struggled against enemies that barely existed in their reality. "You see?" Drakemore's voice was triumphant now. "Even incomplete, the gateway serves its purpose. Your brother's army will be destroyed, and their deaths will provide more than enough power to finish opening the portal. All of Valdris will burn, and from its ashes I shall—" His words cut off in a strangled gasp. Seraphine, free from her magical bonds but drained nearly to the point of final death, had managed to reach him. Her claws were buried in his throat, her remaining strength focused on disrupting his concentration. "Foolish child," he snarled, backhanding her with enough force to shatter stone. The vampire queen crumpled, her body finally failing. But the damage was done. His perfect control over the spell was broken. Mira felt the moment like a physical sensation, the way a master musician might feel a discordant note. The gateway wavered, its edges becoming unstable. "If they could act now?" "Kieran," she said urgently. "The portal, if we can collapse it while it's unstable." "It'll take everything we have," he said, understanding immediately. "All the starlight, all the wolf fire, channeled directly into the gateway itself." "But Mira..." His amber eyes met hers, and she saw the terrible truth he'd already grasped. A feedback explosion that size, this close. "We won't survive it." Around them, the battle raged. Adrian was holding his own against 3 wraiths simultaneously, his blessed blade carving through shadow stuff. But more creatures were emerging every second, and mortal endurance had limits that nightmare armies did not. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. Through their bond, she felt Kieran's absolute certainty, and his acceptance of what had to come. "There is. You survive. You take what power you need and get clear while I hold the feedback. Your kingdom needs its princess. Our kingdom needs its king too," she shot back, silver fire flaring around her as she rejected his sacrifice. "We do this together or not at all." But even as she spoke, she could feel the mathematics of magic at work through her mother's memories. The portal was growing stronger with every passing moment, fed by the violence and death around it. Soon it would stabilize beyond their ability to collapse it, and then the shadow realm would have a permanent foothold in their world. "Mira," Kieran said softly, his hand finding hers. "Do you trust me?" She looked into his eyes, amber fire and wolf-wild determination and love deeper than the roots of mountains, and felt her heart break even as she nodded. "Always." He smiled, the expression full of savage satisfaction and infinite tenderness. "Then trust me to find you again, in whatever comes after." Before she could stop him, he poured everything into their bond, not just his wolf fire, but his very life force, the essence that made him the Alpha King. Power beyond imagining flowed into her, starlight and wolf nature combining into something that transcended both. The cost was immediate and devastating. Kieran collapsed, his strength utterly spent, leaving her holding enough power to shatter worlds, and the terrible knowledge of what victory would demand. The moment Kieran's life force merged with her starlight, Mira understood the true weight of power. It wasn't the exhilaration she'd expected. It was crushing responsibility, the knowledge that entire kingdoms now balanced on her next decision. His body lay motionless in her arms, breathing but barely, his amber eyes dimmed to the faintest ember. "No," she whispered, even as the combined energies threatened to tear her apart from within. "I won't lose you, not like this." But the portal was stabilizing, its edges hardening into permanent reality. Through the growing tear, she could see the vast armies of the shadow realm massing, creatures that would make the current wraiths look like children's toys. They had perhaps minutes before the gateway became unbreakable. Around them, the battle was turning desperate. Adrian's knights were falling back, overwhelmed by enemies they could barely touch. Her brother himself bled from a dozen spectral wounds, his blessed sword growing heavier with each swing. Sir Thane had already fallen, his body motionless beneath a pile of dissolving shadow stuff. Drakemore stood at the portal's edge, his throat torn but healing, his laughter echoing across the carnage. "Do you feel it, Princess? The inevitability? Even with all that borrowed power, you cannot save them all. Choose, collapse the portal and watch your lover die from the feedback, or spare him and watch your kingdom burn." Mira closed her eyes, feeling Kieran's fading heartbeat against her palm. Through their bond, weakened but not broken, she sensed his absolute peace with his choice. He had given her everything willingly, trusting her to find a path he couldn't see. Her mother's memories stirred, offering fragments of ancient knowledge. Starlight magic at its purest wasn't destruction, it was transformation. The same force that turned hydrogen into helium in distant suns, that sparked life from cosmic dust. What if, instead of simply pouring their combined power into the portal's collapse, she could transform the gateway itself? The risk was unthinkable. She would be attempting to rewrite the fundamental nature of a dimensional tear while channeling enough energy to level mountains. One miscalculation would not only kill them both, but potentially tear reality apart permanently. But looking at Kieran's peaceful face, at Adrian's desperate struggle, at the future that awaited Valdris if she failed, there was no choice at all. Mira stood, power coursing through her like liquid lightning. Not just her mother's starlight now, but Kieran's wolf fire and something else. The essence of their bond itself, love given magical form. She walked toward the portal, each step leaving silver flames in the frost. "What are you doing?" Drakemore's voice carried a note of uncertainty for the first time. "Something my mother never had the chance to try," Mira replied, raising her hands toward the dimensional tier. "Fixing your mistake." She poured their combined essence into the portal, but not as an attack. Instead, she began rewriting its fundamental nature, using starlight to transform its connection from the shadow realm to something else entirely. The magic fought her, reality itself resisting such profound change. Pain beyond description lanced through her body as forces meant to exist in the vacuum of space burned through mortal flesh. But Kieran's strength held her together, his wolf nature providing the stability her transformed, human form needed to channel cosmic forces. Through their bond, she felt him stirring, his own essence responding to her desperate need. The portal began to change. Instead of the writhing darkness of the shadow realm, brilliant light started seeping through, not the cold illumination of distant stars, but something warmer, the gentle radiance of healing magic, of life itself given form. Drakemore's scream of rage turned to one of genuine fear as the wraiths around him began dissolving, not destroyed, but purified. The gateway that should have brought forth armies of darkness now poured out waves of restoration that swept across the battlefield. Sir Thane's eyes opened as spectral wounds closed. Adrian's knights found their strength renewed, their blessed weapons blazing with borrowed starlight. Impossible. Drakemore staggered backward, his ancient form withering under the healing light. You cannot simply change the nature of dimensional magic. I'm not changing it, Mira said, feeling Kieran's hand slip into hers as he struggled back to consciousness. I'm completing it. This is what you never understood about starlight magic, Uncle. It doesn't just destroy, it creates. The transformed portal pulsed once more, then began to collapse inward. Not violently, but gently, like a flower closing at sunset. As it sealed itself, waves of healing energy continued to flow outward, restoring the blighted clearing, bringing life back to ground that had known only death. Drakemore made one last desperate lunge toward them, his form already beginning to crumble under the purifying light. But Adrian was there, his renewed blade finding its mark with surgical precision. The vampire lord who had orchestrated 20 years of suffering dissolved into silver motes that scattered on the wind. In the sudden silence that followed, Mira collapsed beside Kieran, their combined power finally spent. But they were alive, both of them, against all odds. "Did we win?" Kieran whispered, his voice barely audible. Mira looked around at the clearing where flowers were already beginning to bloom in the frost, at her brother's approaching smile, at the first hints of dawn touching the eastern sky. "We did." The first rays of true dawn painted the clearing in shades of gold and rose, but Mira barely noticed the natural light. Her world had narrowed to the steady rhythm of Kieran's breathing, the warmth of his hand in hers, and the profound silence that followed 20 years of war. "Mira," Adrian's voice was soft, careful, as if he feared speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile peace they'd won. She looked up to find her brother kneeling beside them, his armor dented and blood-stained, but his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Sister." The word carried everything: relief, joy, the weight of believing her dead for so long. When she tried to sit up, both men moved to help her, and she found herself laughing despite her exhaustion. 3 months ago, she had been utterly alone in these woods. Now she couldn't move without someone trying to catch her. "I'm all right," she said, though her voice came out hoarser than she'd expected. The magic she'd channeled had changed something fundamental in her throat, leaving her words touched with harmonics that hadn't been there before. "We're both all right." Kieran squeezed her fingers. A silent contradiction. Through their bond, permanently altered now, deeper and more complex than before, she felt the echo of what the power transfer had cost him. Not his life, but something almost as precious. The absolute certainty that had always defined the Alpha King was gone, replaced by something more human but also more fragile. "The armies?" she asked Adrian. "Withdrawing. Word of Drakemore's death is spreading through our networks faster than riders could carry it. Without his coordination, the vampire lords are already turning on each other instead of pressing their attacks." Adrian's smile was grim with satisfaction. The shadow creatures simply dissolved when the portal transformed, as if they couldn't exist in a world touched by that much healing light. Sir Thane approached, moving carefully but upright. The spectral wounds were gone, but Mira could see in his eyes the memory of dying. That would stay with him, she realized. Some changes couldn't be healed away. "Your Majesty, Your Highness." His bow was precise despite his recent resurrection. "The clearing is secure. What are your orders?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Orders. As if she were truly the princess she discovered herself to be, as if 3 months of running and hiding had somehow prepared her to command kingdoms. But when she opened her mouth, the words that came were steady, touched with that new harmonic resonance. "Gather our wounded. Send word to the capital that the war is over and the royal line continues. And..." She paused, looking around the clearing where flowers bloomed impossibly in winter frost. "Send envoys to the surviving vampire houses. It's time to discuss terms for peace." "Peace?" Thane's eyebrows rose. "My lady, after what they've done..." "After what Drakemore did," she corrected, and felt Kieran's approval through their bond. "Seraphine helped us in the end. She died to give us the opening we needed. There will be justice, but there will also be mercy." Adrian studied her face with new eyes, seeing something there that made him nod slowly. "You sound like father when you say that, but also like yourself." Like herself. Mira considered that as the knights began moving with purpose around them, tending to the wounded and securing the area. She felt like herself, but a self that had been sleeping for 28 years dreaming she was someone smaller and less complicated. The frightened refugee who had broken into a cabin 3 nights ago was gone as surely as if she'd died in the portal's transformation. "Can you stand?" Kieran asked quietly. She tested her legs, surprised to find them steady despite everything. The starlight magic had settled into her bones differently now, no longer fighting against her human nature, but integrated with it. When she stood, small flowers bloomed in her footprints, not from conscious magic, but simply because that was what her presence did to the world now. Kieran rose beside her, and she saw the change in him too. Still the Alpha King, still dangerous and protective in hers, but tempered somehow, his wolf fire burning steadier and gentler than before. Their sacrifice had marked them both. "The cabin," she said suddenly. "We should..." "Already sent riders to collect our things," he said with a slight smile. "Though I suspect we'll be spending less time hiding in the woods from now on. A shame. I was getting good at stealing leftovers." His laugh was warm and completely free, the sound of a man who had faced death and found something better than mere survival on the other side. "I'll make sure the royal kitchens keep plenty of scraps around." "Your Highness." The title should have felt strange, but it didn't. She was Mira Blackthorne, former refugee and current princess. She was the woman who had transformed a gateway to hell into a fountain of healing. She was the Alpha King's mate and Adrian's sister and herself, all at once. As the sun climbed higher, painting the impossible flowers in brilliant light, Mira looked toward home, the new beginning. Home, as it turned out, was nothing like the fairy tales suggested. 6 months after the battle that ended the war, Mira stood in the palace gardens at dawn, watching her breath mist in the cool spring air. The formal coronation was still hours away, but she'd needed this moment of solitude before the day claimed her completely. Around her the gardens bloomed with impossible vitality, roses in winter, starflowers that shouldn't exist outside of legend, and beneath her bare feet, the soft grass that grew wherever she walked now. The magic had never faded. If anything, it had grown stronger as she learned to accept what she'd become. Not quite human anymore, not quite something else, but uniquely herself. The flowers in her footprints had become as natural as breathing, small miracles that the palace staff no longer questioned. Second thoughts? Kieran's voice carried the warmth of fond amusement. She felt him approaching before he spoke, their bond having settled into something deeper than telepathy, a sharing of souls that made hiding thoughts impossible and unnecessary. Third and fourth thoughts, she admitted, turning into his arms. 6 months of good food and peaceful sleep had restored him completely, though he bore the same fundamental change she did. His wolf fire burned steadier now, less wild but infinitely more controlled. What if I'm terrible at this? Then you'll learn. Like you learned everything else. His fingers traced the silver circlet resting on her dressing table nearby. Elegant, understated. Nothing like the heavy crown that had sat gathering dust in the royal vault for 20 years. Besides, you won't be ruling alone. That was the strangest part of their new reality. Not the magic or the politics or even the weight of rebuilding a war-torn kingdom, but how naturally they'd fallen into partnership. Kieran had never intended to be a king consort, and she'd never imagined sharing power with anyone. Yet somehow it worked, his strategic mind complementing her instinct for healing, his experience balancing her idealism. Adrian's nervous, she said, sensing her brother's presence in the palace behind them. Adrian's been nervous for 6 months. He'll settle once the crown is officially yours, and he can stop worrying about someone challenging your claim. The challenges had come, of course. Distant cousins who'd crawled out of various noble houses, a few vampire lords who'd somehow convinced themselves they deserved consideration. Even one memorable pretender who'd claimed divine right through a prophetic dream. All had been handled with diplomacy, determination, and in one case, a very public demonstration of what her transformed magic could do to someone foolish enough to threaten innocence in her presence. The Seraphine Memorial is finished, Kieran mentioned quietly. Mira nodded, warmth blooming in her chest. The small garden shrine they'd commissioned in the Vampire Queen's honor had been controversial, but she'd insisted. Heroes came from unexpected places, and mercy had to begin somewhere. Several of the surviving vampire houses had sent representatives to today's coronation as a direct result of that gesture. And the refugees from the border villages? Resettled. The last family moved into their new home yesterday. His pride in her was a physical sensation through their bond. The refugee resettlement program had been her first royal initiative, born from intimate knowledge of what it meant to lose everything and have nowhere to turn. The children are already asking when Princess Mira will visit again. Princess. The title still caught her off guard sometimes, though not with discomfort anymore. She'd grown into it the way plants grew toward sunlight, naturally, inevitably, because it was what she was meant to become. Speaking of visits, Kieran continued with studied casualness. The cottage is ready. Their retreat. A modest hunting lodge in the Whispering Pines, not far from where this all began. A place where they could be simply Mira and Kieran instead of their royal highnesses, where she could tend a garden with her hands instead of magic, and he could hunt for the pleasure of it rather than necessity. Where leftover stew waited on the table, and no one expected profound statements about the future of the realm. After the harvest festival, she asked. After the harvest festival, he confirmed. 2 weeks of being magnificently ordinary. The sun climbed higher, painting the palace walls in shades of gold that reminded her of that dawn 6 months ago when everything changed. Soon the bells would ring, calling the kingdom to witness her formal acceptance of a crown she'd never asked for, but had grown to understand she was meant to wear. Mira took Kieran's hand, feeling the calluses earned from sword work and the warmth that meant safety, home, love beyond measure. Together they walked back toward the palace, leaving flowers blooming in their wake, small miracles that would greet the guests arriving for the coronation, proof that sometimes the most broken things could grow into something more beautiful than anyone dared imagine. Behind them, the gardens sang with magic and possibility, and ahead lay a kingdom finally ready to heal.